that's recording.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Lucas from the University of Birmingham, and it's a real pleasure to introduce to you today the Populism in Action project. This project, a study of populism, populist parties and their memberships in 4 different European countries, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and is breaking new ground in what this term populism means in practice. But hey, I'm not the expert on this. I got 2 folks here who will be able to explain it to you. Dr. Daniele Albertazzi of the University of Birmingham, Dr. Stijn van Kessel of Queen Mary University of London, and the technician who's keeping us all chatting today is Josh Allen from Birmingham. Hi to all of you folks. Daniele, I wonder if you could kick us off by telling us just a few words about the project and how it came about.
Yeah, well, the project came about because we noticed that there is a lot of talk in the literature about the crisis of the mass party, political participation, traditional ways of involving people into political parties. But then on the other hand, what happens is that there are still a lot of parties around Europe that in fact seem to buy into this model and believe in this model. Because me and Stijn have been working a lot on populist parties, we were particularly aware of a number of these who still invest in having a rooted organization on the ground, in involving people in activities, in exploiting the members for the purpose of campaigning and reaching out to the public. So the big question was, first of all, is it true that the mass party and traditional, if you want, ways of involving people in politics are either in crisis or even dead? And second question, important question, is why is it that there are quite a fair number of populist radical right parties around Europe that seem to believe in this model? And we wanted to really explore this and realize that there weren't many texts that could help us do this. So we said, let's do it ourselves. Let's get into different countries. Let's talk to people. Let's look at their organization and find out why this model is still very much alive, and what are parties gaining from it. What are people gaining from becoming members of these parties in turn? So it's a big question about the extent to which political participation is changing or is staying the same. And we believe that this is important to know, not just for experts of populist parties, but more generally for all those who are interested in how politics works.
So Stijn, my understanding is that you're covering 4 European countries with the project. Which 4 are these, and why was it these that were chosen for investigation?
So we focus on Finland and Flanders, or Flanders in Belgium, Italy and Switzerland. And we chose these countries because they are characterized by populist parties which have been quite successful, which have been established. So they've been going on for quite a long time already. And all these parties are also characterized by a so-called, or you can argue that they're characterized by a mass party type organization. So they actually invest in building an organization with membership. They try to reach out to these members. They also rely on activists to campaign for them, etc. So they're not examples of a leader-centered kind of small-sized parties in the sense of personnel, etc. So that was one reason why we selected these parties, because we are actually interested in the question of, okay, why do these parties want to invest in such a mass organization, but also what drives the individual members and activists to become part of this party.
So Stijn, I guess this phenomenon called populism, a lot of folks who will be watching us, they will have heard about it, but they might just get it through like general news reports or quick snippets. What is it that you consider to be populism? I mean, what is distinctive about it, say, from other movements and other political approaches that we've lived with in recent years?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion about what populism means because it's used in so many various terms. It's often used as a synonym for racism or opportunism, etc. We use quite a conventional definition of populism, at least conventional in the political science literature now. Populism is basically a set of ideas that distinguishes and makes a moral distinction, if you like, between the elites and the people. And it opposes the elites and it chooses the side of the people. And it sort of blames the political establishment for not listening carefully enough to what the people want. So for ignoring the popular will, if you like. So populists also appeal to the idea of popular sovereignty. Ultimately, decision-making power should lie in the hands of the people, or at least politicians that represent the will of the people. And we've seen a growth in the popularity of such parties, in Europe not least of the radical right. So not all populist parties are radical right, but the most successful populist parties in Europe are those that combine populism with ethno-nationalism, if you like. So they dislike immigration. They're worried about traditional culture being undermined. They don't like the disappearance of borders. So yeah, that's what we call parties of the populist radical right. And we follow a rather conventional definition used in the political science literature in that regard.
So Daniele, as I understand it from Stijn, we're talking about elite versus mass. We're talking at times ethno-nationalism, which is brought in. At times, perhaps a focus on immigration as a touchstone issue. Is that generally true across the 4 countries that the project considers? Or can you point us to what research might be pointing out as ripples, maybe, of difference between the countries in what we mean by populism?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are big differences. If we go back to simply the discussion of what populism is, then of course, there are also left-wing varieties of populism. Populism can go hand in hand, not just with nativism or authoritarianism, but it can also go hand in hand with kind of socialist approaches to how society should be organized. So in itself, populism can even be a left-wing or go hand in hand with left-wing ideologies. What we do is we focus on populist radical right parties, which have been particularly successful in contemporary Western Europe in recent years. And what we find is that in terms of their ideologies, there are quite clear similarities in terms of their authoritarianism, but also in terms of their approach to immigration, issues having to do with allegedly protecting the ethnic group from the arrival of outsiders. So in this sense, the parties that we study, although you could argue some are more radical than others, are pretty similar in this respect. I'm saying some are more radical than others because you could argue that Vlaams Belang in Belgium and the League in Italy are more radical than the Swiss People's Party and the Finns Party, although the Finns Party since 2017 has changed its leader and is now again has moved to the right compared with just a few years ago. So it's also important to keep in mind that, you know, none of these parties or any other party, in fact, is kind of a static world that never changes. It's quite the opposite, and that's why sometimes we have debates even among ourselves about how to define this sort of party, because the truth is they don't stand still. An obvious example I just mentioned is the Finns People Party, which has become more radical, and only a few years ago was a lot of people were even discussing whether it was actually appropriate to define it as populist radical right. The same, the Swiss People's Party in Switzerland. If you go to Switzerland, a lot of people would argue it's a conservative party, and actually it's not as radical as you suggest. In the case of the League, we have something else has happened. That this was a regionalist party focused entirely on northern Italy that is now has national ambitions and has become a nationalist party that wants to speak on behalf of all Italians. So I think it's really interesting how the big changes that have impacted on Europe in recent years, brought about by globalization of the economy, immigration, of course, the climate with so some people would argue that the cultural clash between Christianity and Islam. All of these things are actually bringing about a kind of very rapid change that is also impacting on the ideologies of these parties, and therefore they are also changing in front of our very eyes. And this is another interesting aspect of studying them.
All right, so both of you have set out this idea of what populism is meaning in practice, some of the drivers for it. Let me ask both of you, from your perspectives, do you expect to see a continued surge of populism in Europe amongst these parties and memberships, not only as movements, but actually as, can they govern? Are we going to be talking, we have had populists who have been in government, but do they really have a coherent approach to governing, which means that we can expect them to be the prevalent parties in Europe for the next generation?
I mean, indeed, we've seen that many have already ended up in government, so it's becoming increasingly normal for them to see them in power. But they can rarely do that alone, because most electoral systems in Europe are proportional, so they will always have to end up in coalitions with mainstream parties, and often these are mainstream parties of the center-right. And yeah, what we see, if they end up in government, they try to implement their own agenda. And moreover, I don't think it's necessarily the most important way in which populist parties exert influence. The other way in which they exert influence is by actually pulling center-right parties more towards their own ideology, because they are an electoral threat for these parties. So you see that they, not only by ending up in government, but also by influencing their mainstream competitors, they can have a large impact. And ultimately also on government policy. You see that many center-right parties across Europe have become more restrictive when it comes down to immigration. They've echoed some of the policies of the radical right, perhaps in less alarmist and radical terms, but you clearly see this shift, and that's what research has indicated over and over again.
Yeah, I actually agree. It's actually one extremely interesting aspect of what is going on, and is being studied by academics, but there is still a lot of room for further research. To what extent are not just center-right parties, but also traditional social democratic parties now kind of co-opting the, not just the style, which perhaps kind of, we could argue, superficial thing, but moreover, some of the substantial policies which are being put forward often either by populists more generally, or also more specifically populist radical right parties. It's quite obvious that this is happening across the board. We are speaking from a country, the UK, in which it's quite apparent that the Conservatives have moved into UKIP's territory a few years ago in many ways. So, but it's not just the UK. It has happened in Austria, it's happened to an extent in France, and the list goes on and on. So on the one hand, populist parties, both left and right, have an increasing opportunities to get into government, if nothing else, because there are fewer and fewer people are willing to vote for non-populist parties. There is a lot of fragmentation, and therefore, as Stijn mentioned, all European countries really, apart from very few examples, they need to be in coalitions to govern, and therefore even a more traditional social democratic or indeed conservative or Christian democratic party increasingly will need some of these parties just to govern. So that's point number one. Point number two, they are increasingly supported by larger and larger numbers of voters. So you find, in Switzerland, the Swiss People's Party is by far the largest. But if you believe the polls, which have been quite consistent in recent years, the League has been the largest party in Italy now for some time. The Finnish People's Party now seems to be, again, the largest in Finland. And again, the list goes on. So it's also a matter of the support they themselves attract. And final point is, even when they are not in government, they can provide external support to governments, like has happened in Denmark for a long time, or indeed they can push other parties towards their position, even by being in opposition, because they basically create a narrative that becomes so widespread, perhaps also very widespread in the media, as you can see in the UK, that other parties feel they have no choice but to buy into this narrative anyway. So when that happens, you end up with a party like UKIP, who might have had like maximum of 2 MPs in its history, was basically impacted on the politics of this country to an enormous level. So it's not just, do you have a minister in this government? It's much more complex than
when I read and learn about populists who move into government or aspire to influence governing parties, I can see a coherence in terms of social issues like immigration, or how they approach it. And I can see a coherence in terms of maybe the message on a regional or national scale, a social message. Is there a coherence in their economic policies and programs, though? Whether they're trying to influence the programs of a ruling government, or do they have a coherent economic approach if they get into government themselves?
Well, it's important to make a distinction between their populist style or rhetoric or discourse and the positions that they actually take. And if we're talking about the populist radical right, for them, it's often been argued that the economic issues are secondary to their cultural agenda. So their cultural agenda relates to immigration, to cultural change, etc. Although it's not necessarily completely disconnected from their economic agenda. So what you see with regard to many of those populist radical right parties is that they take so-called welfare chauvinist positions, which basically means they're not pro-neoliberal, or they're not necessarily for reducing welfare. They actually want to sustain welfare for the needy natives and pensioners, for instance, who put in a lot of work in the past and money into public purse. But they want to exclude immigrants from welfare, for instance. So their cultural and economic agenda are somewhat interwoven in that regard. In terms of more general economic positions, they tend to vary a little bit across countries. So they have a less consistent economic agenda. If you look at it comparatively across countries, their cultural agenda is more consistent in that regard. But this is not to say, the main point is that economic issues are not necessarily of primary importance for such parties, and hence you also see more diversity throughout countries or across borders in that regard.
Daniele, you've written about the Italian case, and there's been a great deal of change where the Lega Party has been part of the coalition government and now is back outside the coalition government. Does that issue of the Lega being in or out of government have anything to do with problems or the priority, as it were, of the economic situation in Italy? Or is that really peripheral to the party's future success?
I think it's an ingredient, an important ingredient, because the thing with Italy is that the economy has stalled for about 25 years. It's 25 years without growth. Whether in government you had the right led by Berlusconi, or which the League has been a member 5 times, or whether in government you had the center left. I mean, the economy is, of course, a major issue. Since Italy joined the euro, Berlusconi, first of all, and then also the Lega, the League, kind of started targeting the euro, basically blaming the euro for all the economic problems of the country. So the economy is absolutely, paramount. The thing in Italy is that, which makes it particularly interesting, is that there is a lot of competition between the populist parties. And I mean, if you look at the last election, 2 voters out of 3 cast a vote for a populist party. Now, of course, as we already mentioned at the beginning, populism is not the only ingredient of this party's ideology. So you have the populist radical right, but you also have the populist, more moderate right of Silvio Berlusconi. And you also have a party which has been defined as valence populism, which is a 5-star movement. The definition basically means that populism is the only core message that they have. All the rest can change, right? So you say certainly they are now a populist party, but it's not unclear what they are beyond that, in the sense that they borrow policies from left and right, quite obviously. You could say there are 70% left-wing and 30% right-wing in what they propose. But I think that the League has a particularly, if you want, difficult job in terms of having also to compete with others that in some ways are similar in terms of their message. So it also becomes a matter of credibility. Looking at recent events, I'd say that the main reason why they got kicked out of government is simply that they made a strategic mistake. They tried to bring down a government to get fresh elections. That in Italy is never guaranteed. Just because a government ends, it doesn't in any way mean that there will be fresh elections. That's not what the Constitution says. It's a parliamentary democracy, and what happened is that a new majority was found, and now they are in opposition. And it's very typical of what may happen in kind of day-to-day politics when you miscalculate. I think what is interesting is precisely the extent to which these are just normal parties, really ordinary parties that have the usual strategies and make the usual mistakes, if you want.
Well, gentlemen, the clock ticks on, so I think we can only offer an introduction to populism today. But I want to thank both of you for bringing the Populism in Action project to life in this introductory video cast. That's Stijn van Kessel of Queen Mary University London, Dr. Daniele Albertazzi, University of Birmingham. Thank you both. Josh Allen, thank you for keeping everything together. To all of you, thank you for viewing. The Populism in Action project can be found on eaworldview.com. That's EA Worldview, a website specializing on not only Europe, but the US and Middle East. You can also find the Populism in Action project at @_PIAP on Twitter, or you can find it on Facebook. Come by, drop in with your own comments. Let us know what you'd like to have a video cast on. Next time we will be talking to you, we might actually, gentlemen, ask you what you think about coronavirus and how that's affected populism or the fate of populist parties in Europe. But as I say, we will leave it at that for right now. Thanks to all of you. Everybody stay safe, be decent to each other.